some were not so noble. Some didn't display a high degree of loyalty. Some weren't as trustworthy. Some didn't hold on to the charge well. Some didn't walk the straight and narrow. Some folded. Some failed. Some waved the white flag of surrender and just gave up. Some couldn't take it any longer. It hurt too much. It went on too long. The storms never seemed to end, and when it seemed to slow down, another one came, and some just said, enough already. Too much hurt, too much pain, too much cost. And it wasn't just them. It wasn't just the burden of self that drove the surrender. It was their kids, or their grandkids, or their spouses, or their brothers and their sisters and their nieces and their nephews and their neighbors. It was just too many. Not fair. Not fair. Ever been there? Just shake our fist in the face of heaven. No more. And they packed it in. And it wasn't like it was a secret, that small group that went that road, took that path. Everybody else knew it, because frankly, everybody else was bearing the weight and the consequences of it. Everybody knew it. Those that headed off in surrender. Now, again, to be fair, most were suffering 2,000 years ago, these early Jewish believers in Jesus, and they were facing all of those hardships, homes being burnt down, families being separated, beaten, imprisoned, killed, all the stuff we've talked about that they were facing. Indescribable hardship. And we would say, from a human perspective, they didn't deserve that. Isn't that the natural? What were they doing? What was so wrong? The crime they were accused of was an undying love and loyalty to Jesus, who they believed was their Lord, Master, and Savior, and they were unequivocal. They absolutely would not shrink back. They were convinced of who He is and what He accomplished, and they were loyal, they were faithful, they were obedient, they followed in His footsteps, even in the same path that He walked and many of the prophets of the Old Covenant walked. They were willing to walk in the same steps as Peter would later challenge us as believers to do. We must follow in His steps. Jesus, who uttered no threats, who spoke not in retaliation, who did not resist, and were called to follow it, and they were doing it. They didn't deserve this. But they suffered anyway. But others who faced the same hardship and the same pain and some of the same losses along the midst of that, some of them waving the white flag, said, I'm done. I'm done. And while, to a large degree, they were still in the same place as the others who had lost everything. Many of them did as well. By waving the white flag, it was their way of saying, maybe I can recover from this, but I've had enough. Many of them still may not have had homes. Many of them still had been, for a short term, maybe separated as families. Some of the consequences they were still reeling from, but at least by the decision that they chose to make, to end their loyalty and devotion to Jesus, at least they thought they would stem the tide of the storm. At least it'll stop. Maybe they thought they could return to their Jewish communities, those who weren't believing in Jesus, and at least have some place to live, some people who would embrace them, some place where there's safety, some place to start over. Now, frankly, for that group, a lot of them didn't get what they bought. And a lot of them were out there now, totally alone. Because here's what happened to most of that small group that just waved the white flag. Their thinking was, just buy some relief. Can't handle it anymore. They thought that others would understand. That's what they thought. The believers in Jesus who were holding firm, seeing the others wave the white flag, frankly, a lot of those faithful believers who were still in it, they were a bit ticked. You guys are bailing out on us? Because all that meant is that the rage that went against that small sliver of group now kind of carried over to those who were holding on to the faith. You guys bailing out on? You got a lot of nerve. How could you commit such treason against Jesus and against us? How could you do that? So that small group, man, they were hated by those who were faithful believers in Jesus for desertion of the troops. And the Jewish community who hadn't believed in Jesus, I mean, they're going to be suffering in the years to come as well, because the wave of Roman opposition is about to unfold, and it's all Jews. Believers, non-believers, Rome didn't care. You're all going down. It was going to hit the fan. They thought they were escaping. Not for long. But these who had decided to desert thought they would be able to reacclimate and start from scratch somewhere in the Jewish community, the large Jewish community who never believed and embraced Jesus to begin with. At least the synagogue would take them back. At least the Jewish community would give them a place to live. What many of them found out was they still were hated. They still were viewed as turncoats because they had believed in what they thought was a false Messiah and a false prophet and a liar and a deceiver, this Jesus who started this bizarre sect that they rejected because the rabbis and the Pharisees and the Sadducees all rejected them. They still were marked by their past identity. It traveled with them. You were one of them. You believed in him. You're telling me you've given it all up? We don't believe you. You're scarred, you're branded, you carry it with you. Get out of here. You know what happened to that small sliver of group who thought they were buying some time? Guess what they had? Nothing. Nobody. Nowhere to go. Interesting. I really think that this 12th biographical sketch in Hebrews chapter 11, the last individual that's referred to before you get into this general concluding paragraph in verses 32 to 40 that we'll look at next week as a whole, I think this last biographical sketch fits that particular group, a small sliver who needed grace, undeserved favor, who needed mercy. They needed a life raft. They needed a lifesaver. Because some of them were really believers in Jesus. But oh, they did a Peter. I never knew him. Denied him. Treason. And they were dealing with the guilt that tore them to shreds, and the reality of circumstances that now were worse than before. And I'm stunned, in a positive way, at how far the reach of God's mercy and grace and unconditional love extends. For all of the challenges that you and I have seen in this paragraph of biographical sketches to stir the faith of those who are going through these hardships, here is a God who sees all and realizes that there is this small group who are hurting unbearable anguish and pain. And while the lashes of the Jews may not have been upon them, or Roman oppression may not have yet affected them. Now it's been eased. They were carrying a weight of oppressive guilt from their past that they would have presumed would have taken them one step too far. We'll never get past this one. Never be able to overcome this hurdle. Never be able to undo what we have done. There's no more room for forgiveness. We've gone over the line. Whatever the unpardonable sin was, if there's a new one, we've just invented it. We've done a Peter and more. And there's no fish fry for us with Jesus. This is it. We're done. God will never forgive us. No one will ever believe us. No one will ever embrace us. There's no place to turn. Here is the lifeline in biographical sketch number 12. It's absolutely stunning. Shocking. If you were a faithful Jew and even a faithful believer in Jesus, and you were told what's coming in this letter that was being delivered to you to encourage you in your anguish, and the word was out that somewhere toward the end of the letter, he's going to give you a rah-rah speech of encouragement with biographical sketches of people who will charge your batteries and get you flowing in your loyalty to Jesus and pressing on, you might make a list in your head, and some of them who are in the list we would have nailed. We would have expected the Enochs and the Noahs and the Abrahams and the Josephs. We would have had those names down. Some of them would have surprised us, like, the sites that we've already noted of the illustrations of faith of Isaac and Jacob, and even Joseph's example that cited. Those would have been surprises. And the unnamed ones, the parents of Moses, not even named, kind of speaks. That would have been a little bit of a surprise. And Sarah's stuff may be a surprise, but man, lo and behold, this one would have really stopped everybody in their tracks. What's this one doing here? I mean, there's a lot of issues to question about verse 31. A whole bunch of them. Here is our verse, by faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. Okay, here comes our interactive portion of the sermon. What are some of, we mentioned this earlier, what are some of the obvious, on the surface surprises that immediately emerge that any first-hand reader would have picked up on? Now, of course, they've got the advantage because they're Jews and Greeks and they got all that stuff that are there. But what are some of the obvious things that would come to the surface right off the top that would say, whoa, this is one I didn't expect? What's one? The one is what she's known for. We're going to hold on to that for a second. That's the big one that's there. She's a harlot. What else? She wasn't Jewish. She is a Gentile. And connected to that, not only not Jewish, but what is she? It's not mentioned here, but what do we know from Joshua chapter 2? What's her nationality? What's her identity? What's her race? She is who? She's a Canaanite. We're going to talk about that one a little bit. It's not just any non-Jew. He's a Canaanite, huge issue. Descendant of the Amorites, huge. So you got a Gentile, a Canaanite Gentile, a harlot, and one that would typically be ignored. She's a she. She's in a patriarchal culture, the models are generally male. But this is the second she's a she in the list. First one's, tempered with a lot of bad stuff that precedes her. So this one comes with all kinds of yellow flashing lights and sirens and attention getters and, pull off the side of the road, take a deep breath, kind of, what in the world is this one doing here? Alongside of Enoch is Rahab. Whoa. This is Indigestion City. Noah and Abraham, Rahab. Joseph, Rahab. Moses, Rahab. Man, they don't fit in the same sentence. They don't fit next to each other. Bury her in the epilogue. Small print, hard to find. Inference, innuendo, secret language. I don't know what you want to do, but most would never put her in the list. But that is precisely why it is. What really stands out is the first obvious statement that was mentioned here in Hebrews 11:31 is how she is so named and identified. And we find that in several New Testament references as well as in the book of Joshua where she is introduced to us. Always attached to her name is this description, Rahab the harlot. Now, we would think in our culture that many of us would not like to be identified by our, uncomfortable past. You think so? I mean, David had an uncomfortable past. You think he'd want to be noted by it? Abraham had an uncomfortable past. You think he wanted to be noted by the guy that ditched his wife as his sister twice? Yeah, you want to have that attached to you? I don't think Abraham would stick that up as a moniker for himself. Do you think? I don't think he would. You? Probably not. You think Peter wanted to be noted as Peter the deserter? Not dessert, as in chocolate cream pie, but the deserter, the one who abandoned, the one who ditched Jesus at the end. There's a lot of times in the past, there's stuff that's a part of our lives we don't want to be known by, particularly. And here she is. Look at what she's known by. Every place she's introduced. It's Rahab the harlot. It's Rahab the harlot. It's Rahab the harlot. Gee, thanks. That's sticking with me, isn't it? The fact that it's part of the biblical record, it really sticks, doesn't it? So we got to ask ourselves some important questions about why in a chapter where there are no descriptive titles attached to names, there are statements and moments of great faith, and she has one as well. If the others aren't described by their blemishes and warts and scars and failures and shortcomings and past garbage, why are they sticking that to her? That's not fair. In a lot of that's not fair statements. And there it is. Rahab the harlot. Maybe if we understand a little bit something of the record of her faith from Joshua chapter 2 and so forth, we'll hopefully paint a little portrait that will get a little clearer here. So she is introduced in Joshua chapter 2. It's an interesting portion. We've inferred it in last week's message about the model of Joshua and the fall of Jericho. You remember when you get to Joshua chapter 2, where you are is the Israelites under Joshua's leadership are just now on the east side of the Jordan River. They haven't crossed yet. We talked about crossing over and the second Red Sea event with the waters parting and going up to the north 15 miles to stop the flow of this river, the Jordan River, and dry ground again, and they're going to cross over. That's about to happen, but in preparation for that, in advance, what Joshua does is send out a group of spies. Second time that's happening, Moses did it years earlier. Didn't turn out too well years before. This group, Joshua sends out some of his chief leaders among them, and they're making their way the other side of the Jordan River to that major fortress of Jericho that would have to be overcome. It was the largest major city that they would have to conquer if they're to set up some kind of a settlement to be able to advance through the land. So Jericho is going to be a major strategic issue, and we talked about last week how God did that in surprising ways. So here they are sending these spies out in order to be able to see what's on the other side of that monster wall we talked about, wide enough for 2 chariots to be able to pass with room to spare. A huge fortress, a monstrous wall, impregnable. There were homes that were on top of this wall. That's how big it was and how wide it was. Homes that soldiers stayed in, and also the homes of some who provided troop, extracurricular benefits and entertainment. And Rahab and her family were among those. Well-known, well-regarded, highly respected. She lived up top the wall with her family to fulfill her military obligation to the troops. Now understand something, that within the culture of the Canaanites, think Canaanite for a moment, they were a culture that was diametrically opposed to most civilized cultures that respect some kind of norms of behavior in interpersonal relationships and have some codes of morality and conduct that are proper and improper. Most. Well, maybe not any longer. But it used to be. And within this Canaanite culture, being a prostitute or a harlot was actually considered a major plus in the society. It was an honorable profession. Because in Canaanite culture, and by the way, the Canaanites were descendants of the earlier tribe of the Amorites, and they get front and center name in the covenant that God made with Abraham about 500 years before. Did you know that? Look quickly with me at Genesis chapter 15 and see when they're so noted. This is the chapter of Abraham's real heart conversion. Second time that God speaks to Abraham, makes a covenant with him. The covenant and promise, I'll make of you a great nation. Through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. The Messiah will come through your seed. This is the time when Abraham's heart response was so powerful that in Genesis 15 verse 6 we are told, quoted by Paul in the book of Romans and the 4th chapter, then Abraham believed in the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. God implanting his very perfect nature in Abraham in response to his absolute heart of faith in the promise of God. No sacrifice stuff is here. No substitution stuff is here. This is all based upon God's eternal plan that Jesus would one day be the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. That sacrifices temporary for sin would one day be offered, but God just saw a simple heart of faith believing the promise of God and justified him right there. Remarkable. Now, as part of all of the promises that God is restating to Abraham, that he'd already mentioned, I mean, you're going to have a kingdom as great as the sands of the sea and the stars of the heaven and all the stuff that he keeps mentioning over and over again. You got this statement that starts in verse 13 of Genesis 15. Just a quick look. Genesis 15, verse 13. God said to Abram, know for certain. Now this is prophecy God's giving to Abraham. It's kind of like a just quick summation prophecy, and we can see, as we look back on the scripture, how and when it was all fulfilled. Verse 13, God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Kind of forecasting Israel in Egypt. In the future, your descendants, you're not going to be there, but I'm just kind of cluing you in on what's going to happen so that when they get there, they'll see this promise and realize I had all this stuff planned. You're going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs, where they will, verse 13, they'll be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. That's pretty specific prophecy, isn't it? And of course, we know when it was fulfilled. The Jews, 2 million of them growing that large and strong in the Nile River basin, there in the Fertile Crescent in Egypt, and all that prepares the way for Moses and his stuff. So you got verse 13 predicting stuff 500 years in the future. Verse 14, I will also judge the nation whom they will serve. That's God judging Egypt. Remember the armies pursuing Moses as they're going through the Red Sea and swallowing them. God, I will judge the plagues on Egypt that precede all of that. I will judge the nation whom they will serve. Bondage, servitude, slavery. And afterward they will come out with many possessions. Exactly as God did and commanded, taking many of the treasury, the gold and so forth with them. Verse 15, but as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. Not going to be there. I'm going to take you well before that. And you'll be buried at a good old age. And verse 16 is the one of interest for us. in the midst of this judgment and all that stuff. In the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. That is, when God gave the promise, they were kind of on the journey. They were in the place that would eventually be the land, but not quite yet, not ready yet. But eventually God says, you're going to be heading out of that. You're going to be heading southwest. I'm going to have you for a while in this Egypt. You're not going to be, but eventually you're coming back here. But I'm not finished yet with the Amorites. Those are the forerunners who will later become the Canaanites. I'm going to allow their wickedness to continue to get more wicked. And this is what happened over the next 400 years to this tribal people, originally the Amorites, now they are the Canaanites, and they were as bad can be. Sometimes we struggle in Joshua chapter 6 where God commands Joshua, you're going to wipe out this tribe utterly, completely. Men, women, children, animals, everything. Nothing is to be left. Kill them all, burn it all. And we struggle with that, and our culture struggles with that. God is a mean God, an angry God, a vicious God, a vindictive God, losing his control God, a murderous God, a slaughtering God, just like the gods of the terrorists of our age. Put them up both in, that's where our culture goes. What we don't realize is the contrast between the people groups. The Canaanites were among the most vicious of peoples, tribal peoples on the face of the earth. Sexual activity among them wasn't just the kind of stuff that we see in our culture that is rampant. I mean, it would make that stuff look very, very tame. Their sexual orgies included incestuous relationships of parents with children, cousins, brothers, and sisters. And it was a part of what they actually believed. The more sexual, gross behavior, the closer you actually came to the gods of the Canaanites. It was their way of traveling up the staircase and becoming like the gods. So sexual orgies of the most perverted kind, including with animals and beyond, became a part of their worship practice. So prostitutes were actually priestesses of the Canaanites. Priestesses? Female priests. Whatever. They were honored. They were revered. Rahab, to be stuck with the descriptive term Rahab, the harlot among the Canaanites, was an honor, not a discredit, not a criticism, not a negative, not something against her. It would be the equivalent of being called a general in the Canaanite army. A queen among them. She was honored, revered, respected. To the troops performing her duties for their well-being during their rest periods while there are no battles. An honored woman. That's the culture in which she is joined. In fact, such a wicked culture indeed that what they would actually do, kind of a little bit frightening to us, so part of their sacrifices to their gods in their sexual orgies, newborns, even before birth in the womb, would be intentionally aborted, or at birth would be killed, for the purpose of placing the remains of the infant in an earthenware jar. And when the great Canaanite cities would be built, these earthenware jars with newborn remains would be placed in the wall, upon which the stones would be built to build a city. And the earthenware jar with an infant child's remains were called a foundation sacrifice to their gods. The infant remains was a worship sacrifice to their gods to lay the foundation of the city. So is that someone that you want to sit down and chat with? Let's compare religious beliefs. Maybe we will understand each other. After all, you reason the way you reason, and I reason the way I reason. And if we sit down and talk long enough, we will appreciate each other's reason, and we will come and reason together. And then after we reason, you will cut my head off. The Canaanites were as evil could possibly be. They stood out. And the holy God of the heavens saw the wickedness of this people, and the only negotiating with that kind of demonic evil was the negotiation of annihilation. Eliminate them. Burn it. You can't even have their remains in the land. It's holy ground. It's yours. That's who they are. And Rahab is among them. Which becomes all the more stunning because she had the same light as every other Canaanite. And at the upper crust, she knew a lot more than maybe what the common people knew. She knew what all the troops knew. She knew what all the generals knew. She knew what the leaders of the Canaanite people knew. She's kind of like part of the inside cabinet of the Canaanite military and governing system. She knew everything else that they knew. And we get a sense of what she knew in Joshua chapter 2. It's interesting. Look at this with me. Joshua chapter 2, verses 9, 10, and 11. When the spies arrive, they had to get somehow over the wall secretly to get into the city to be able to see what's going on. And obviously they dressed as Canaanites and they found ways to... But they found their way up to a place of Rahab's home on top of the wall, and somehow they were immediately placed with a challenge because she found them out. And now they're dead in the water. She identifies them. And the assumption's going to be, we're not going back. If we do, it's going to be heads without bodies or bodies without heads as a warning, we're done. We're finished. What they found in the providence of God would have caused them to be looking at each other in utter disbelief. I mean, it was a miracle greater than the one that's going to follow in the parting of the waters of the Jordan River. Look at what she says in verse 9. Of Joshua chapter 2. They are in her home, and she's assuming she's calling the troops in. They're finished. She said to the men, now these are words. Don't read over this slowly, man. Fast. Read it slow. Take your time. Digest. Look at what she is saying. Her first words to them. I know that the Lord, whoa, Jehovah, your God. I know. Certainty, absolute, conviction, not intellectual, but in soul and heart. And I know the Lord, not their, yours, the Lord, has given you this land. That's her first word. You got to be kidding me. You're looking at this. You got to be kidding me. Soldiers are going to come. They're playing games with us. I know it. I know, verse 9, the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. That is also a prophetic statement of what's going to happen. She knew it. She knew that God was going to wipe out her tribe and that they were done. and they had it all. They had all the warriors, they had all the training, they had all the experience, they had all the defense. It was their land. These are a bunch of ragtag. They never fought enough battles, a couple, but they are not prepared for this one. I know it. For verse 10, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. You talk about, this isn't cable news, but man, news traveled from tribe to tribe to tribe over long distances. The reputation of the Israelites had well preceded them. And they had it nailed. They heard about that group growing up in Egypt. They heard about the oppression of Pharaoh in Egypt. They heard about the slavery. They heard about the plagues. They heard about a Red Sea parting, dry ground crossing over, Egyptian army being swallowed up. They heard about 40 years of stupidity. Word came. 40 years. Dumb, dumb, dumb. 40 years worth. Heard about it all. But here they were, knocking at the door. They heard it all. They heard what you did to two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. Couple pre-invasion battles prepping the way. I mean, they were scared to death. Verse 11, when we heard it, our hearts melted. No courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God, in heaven above and on the earth beneath. Wow. She's already been converted. She never met a Jew. She just heard the rumor. I mean, I've traveled to places in the Amazon jungles and where missionaries have gone in, and incredible stuff happens as a consequence of a building time and relationship and teaching chronologically through the scriptures and so forth. But I've also heard of other isolated tribal groups who've never had anybody come in. And they're rare and they were few, but they were believing the message of who Jesus was, and as far as anybody knew, they never heard it from anybody. But here's a Canaanite woman who has already come to faith, and she never heard a word directly from a Hebrew. The rumor alone of who this God was enough to break through her. This is stunning. Stunning. Startling. Bewildering. She had the same light as everybody else. And here she is in absolute faith. The contrast, when you go back to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, is the others of her people, the word that describes them in Hebrews 11:31, they were disobedient. They were not only not believing in the God of the Hebrews, even though they were freaking out over what they had accomplished and what they did, they were resentful in their disobedience. They would intentionally not obey and submit to the same God that Rahab had surrendered to. Intentionally remain in their own arrogant pagan practices. But not her. Two spies come, she's surrendering. And so rather than find them out when the troops come, assuming that the word was out that they were up there, she hid them, protected them. I love the words in here in verse 31, the end of Hebrews 11:31, she welcomed the spies in peace. The word welcome in the Greek means to receive and embrace, but in the purest sense of the term. She received them in the peace of God, shalom. Because she had come to discover God's peace and God's forgiveness of her past. Apparently she had done business with God, and her past would no longer identify and mark who she is. She is going to model transforming faith. In fact, an illustration so profound that in the next New Testament letter, which was actually written much earlier, the book of James, when James is trying to make his point about what real faith is demonstrated by transformation, by works, by righteousness, because faith changes from the inside out. In James chapter 2, verse 25, James uses her as a model. Rahab the harlot. You want to see what real faith is? It's not just words. I believe in Jesus. He died for my sin. And whoop-de-doo, my life is unchanged. Same as. Ho-hum. Oh, really? James, you show me by faith by your words. I'll show you by faith by my life. Because real faith, saving faith, is transformed. And he holds up Rahab as an illustration of real faith. So we know that Rahab's believed. This is real stuff. She's been radically changed by believing in the Hebrew God. And she proves it in this instant. She is going to risk her life, her entire family. Think about that for a second. Because thousands of years later, here are Jews facing it, whose families were at risk. Wives, children, grandchildren, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, all of them. And they're waving the white flag to protect them. I got to do something. I got to take action. I. Who is he? Who is the king? So Rahab comes out of the shadows, risking her entire family. And they're mentioned. Parents and cousins and brothers and sisters and extended family, they're all honored. They're all living there because of her. You know, she's the queen, if you will. She's risking all of them. Why? Because she has an absolutely undying devotion to a God she never even heard about from one of the Hebrews. He is the Lord your God. He is the Lord my God. He reigns supreme. He is sovereign. I've turned away from that garbage, from my past, from my lifestyle, from those decisions. I will honor Him. I will believe Him. I will risk everything for Him. Can you start to see how this becomes a message for a small sliver of people 2,000 years ago who had thrown in the towel, who had ditched, who had done a Peter 100 times worse, who thought to themselves, there's no hope for me. I've crossed the line. This is treason beyond what's forgivable. No, it ain't. Here's Rahab. Here's Rahab. You can still demonstrate real saving faith like she did. There is yet forgiveness for you. Hey, listen, Rahab got her reward because in Joshua chapter 6, we can't look at it, verses 22 to 25. Joshua chapter 6, you find that when they're coming in and about to take over the place, and remember we talked about the walls last week, the amazing archaeological evidence that supports the biblical text, the burning of the city and not taking of the grain that got it, and the walls falling outward, not inward, and they kind of walked up and prayed. All that's there. And in Joshua chapter 6, verses 22, 23, 24, 25, here's Joshua's command to the troops as they're going in. Well, I want to remind you guys again, multiple times over, this is a pledge we're making. We are protecting her. We're rescuing her. We're taking her and her family and her parents and her brothers and her sisters and everybody in her extended household. We're taking them out of the city. We're guarding them. We have troops designed just for them. And we're taking them out, and we're planting them in our camp. We are embracing them. She is now a daughter of Israel. She is a daughter of Israel. Rahab, the harlot. Rahab the transformed. Rahab the faithful. That's only her past. They honored her past. She's been delivered. Let it be known, she's saying, by what I was, I want you to know what I've been delivered to. Protect her. She's honored. Life, mercy, protection for all of them. More, you think that's enough? You want to stop there and say, that's good enough. Like the Passover song, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If God only did that, Dayenu, it would have been enough. I can't ask for any more. God did something really off the wall. You know what it was? Look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Go ahead, go there. Take a peek. First one, get there. Tell me what's surprising in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Here is Matthew's kingly genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. You know those boring genealogies that give you a good nap? If you can read it and get to verse 5, you've already gone beyond the anesthesia at the surgery. You know? Counting to 5. Oh my goodness! A Gentile in the Messianic line? Oh. A Canaanite in the Messianic line? A harlot in the Messianic line? You kidding me? Rahab is apparently the great-great-grandmother of King David. My goodness. How far does grace go? How far? See, now, 2,000 years ago, the faithful Jews who were believing in Jesus, come back to this as we come to the end here. The faithful Jewish believers in Jesus who were taking it and not retreating looked at that small group who betrayed. Anathema. We have nothing to do with them. We shun them. Never again. They speak of sorrow over what? Never again. Don't talk to them. And here God sticks in Rahab. If the God of grace would deliver her, reveal himself to her, without your help and your ancestors' help, by the way. If the God of heaven would deliver her and deliver her entire clan and family, and she would be embraced as part of the family of Israel, if he would grasp her, how dare you not do the same? If the God of grace didn't look at them as treasonous, but as those who were broken and weak and fallen, desperately needing forgiveness and restoration, how will we not mimic the God of heaven? See where it fits? They needed something of a swift kick too. And so it is. How do we respond to Rahab's faith? Yeah, there's the first one there, the issue of personal accountability. Rahab had the same light as the other Canaanites, except God chose to remove scales from eyes, the blindness that was there, the deafness that was there. The rest were without excuse, she believed. Personal accountability. I guess that was somewhat of a challenge to those who had ditched following Jesus. They were accountable for their decision. And for the Jewish believers in Jesus who were ready to also turn their back on that group when they seemed to be sorrowful over what they had done, they were personally accountable. Hey, we all are responsible for our decisions. Any path we've gone is recoverable and forgivable. A God of grace will reach us where we are. Those in prison can find redemption and hope and forgiveness and restoration. There may be a price to pay. There may be a moniker we carry from our past. I guess she did. I'm sure her relationships among the Israelites, people watched, people guarded. Probably protections that were kind of relationally built in just to be wise. Made sense. Don't want to be stupid. But you want to embrace. You don't want to isolate. We're all responsible. Think of maybe some people in your life that you won't connect to, you won't relate to, you won't embrace as a brother or sister because of what they did or who they are or whatever it is comes as baggage for them. They're responsible for their stuff, but so are we for our response to them. How dare we, in the light of Rahab, isolate, excommunicate, and decide for ourselves who's subject to judgment? How dare we enter the place of God? Our call is to reach out. Our call is to be those who demonstrate grace. That doesn't mean we ignore. They're accountable. We hold them accountable. They suffer the consequences of sin. But if there is a repentant heart, how dare we take and hold on to the past? But we do it all the time. There's the issue of prejudice and acceptance that's connected, isn't it? We deal with it racially, but it's much broader than that, isn't it? There would have been a lot of reasons for the Jewish community to say no to her and to her family. Maybe some of them would have said, maybe she showed faith, but what about her mom and dad, brothers and sisters, their kids and all? We're bringing the whole mishbucha, the whole clan in here, the whole family. I'm supposed to honor them, protect them. What about the soldiers? We're protecting her? That piece of Oh. Sometimes we give attention to the big social issues where we have certain prejudices and they are really ingrained. But it goes way beyond that. We carry those kinds of prejudices for stuff that people do to us. Ponder that one. But there is the issue of pure grace. God's grace extended to her family. They didn't deserve it. We don't know anything about their faith. God's grace extended to her to preserve and protect her and to include her in the line of Messiah. God's grace extended to her salvation as a Canaanite from a wicked, most vile tribe as a prostitute, reminding us that the Davids discover God's grace, the Peters discover God's grace, the Paul, the murderer, discovers God's grace. Who are we to want to withhold it? Grace is greater than all of our sin. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. Let's pray. Lord, in the model of Rahab, it's closer to home than perhaps we would have thought. Thinking, our minds, our hearts stirred, and we ask that your Spirit would strive with us, that you would speak to us in our own world, in our own life, in our own circumstance, facing the stuff that we face with the people that we address and deal with. And Lord, give us eyes to see and ears to hear the message to us of your grace to Rahab the harlot. Lord, we give you ourselves. Pray you would speak deliverance, peace, hope, and cleansing. Thank you that she welcomed the spies in shalom. May you bring us to that same place of peace. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Let's just close, sing that first stanza of Amazing Grace. It is a sweet sound, isn't it? How sweet the sound. Let's stand just the first stanza.